Hello, welcome to our collaborative podcast. This is a really fun experiment. My name's Leanne Hughes, based in Brisbane, Australia. I have a podcast called First Time Facilitator. The reason I started it is because I was working in an organization and my manager threw me in the deep end and sent me around the world running workshops, and I had no idea what I was doing. So I basically got back home to Australia, rang friends, asked them how they did it, and record those conversations. So that's what brings me here today. Yeah, how about you, John?
Wonderful. Yeah, no, I'm an organizational change consultant. I work at the intersection of design, change, and org effectiveness. I've been working in the field of continuous improvement, moving into business transformation, but I fell into facilitation. I fell into working with large groups, trying to get from A to B, not really knowing how to do it. So it was only when I started to get to know and work with Tricia, who will introduce herself shortly, that I started thinking about it more of as a discipline. You don't have to be an amateur and kind of feel your way through this process. There are ways of doing this that can not only help you be more successful, but can actually make it a little less stressful. And so I'm sure we're going to pull at those tendrils and threads and get into it. But that's my story. I've started in the UK, moved back to North America, and currently in the Midwest here in Wisconsin. And I am a podcast co-host with Tricia Conyers. Over to you.
Well, hi, I am Tricia Conyers, and I guess I'm a little bit Leanne and I'm a little bit Dawn because I have my background in implementing change and leading change and helping clients to implement change. And a big part of that was facilitating sessions for them to learn something new. And I, a little bit like you, Leanne, fell into, well, how do we create experiences where people are going to get engaged and where they want to learn and where they want to open themselves up to doing something different and needing to learn something new in order to achieve new levels of performance as part of the change program. And that's where it kind of started for me. And it was an area that I just found a lot of passion and interest and fun in discovering, and went on to kind of do more and more in that area until I became a certified facilitator in different techniques and things like that. So a little bit John, a little bit of John, a little bit of Leanne, and I am connecting today with you guys from Trinidad and Tobago. So we're covering quite a range of the globe today, from Australia to Trinidad to the Midwest. So we have a nice little, coverage going of the whole globe today. So yeah, that's what brings us together. And I guess that's what brings us together, is this shared passion for facilitation, right? We have that in our DNA, the three of us. So what comes to mind? When you think about facilitation, Leanne, what really stands out for you as kind of, what drives you? What's your passion in that? What lights you up about facilitation?
Oh, so much. I think the reason, I guess even before I was a facilitator, I was that annoying person in a workshop as a participant that was like the over eager, just wanting to learn, get all the resources right up the front, contributing. And I just love being in workshops. Even as a participant, I was at a retreat the other week and I just really enjoyed sitting back and just watching that experience unfold. I think for me, often I can get stuck in my own mind and ruminate on ideas and just really think deeply. But it's so interesting. The second I have a conversation with someone, if it's even just a coffee, things unlock. I say things I've never even said before, phrases emerge, and you think, wow, and you have that experience in a group, right? Where you kind of scale that and the amount of conversations and the dynamics and what's going on. There's just so much power and potential that can be unlocked, I think, through dialogue and through creating that experience. And I love how you, Tricia, talk about experience and not workshops. It's much more than that. So that's why I love it. I just geek out on both sides of it. John, I noticed you sort of chuckling a bit there.
I've been chuckling because your story, the origin story, if I can call it that, resonates with me. It's because I've encountered so many people who are participants in a workshop that I'm delivering, or maybe Tricia and I are working on. They're the ones, they are incredibly eager. They want to, if you're doing it in person, they're the ones who are right up there at the whiteboard or at the flip chart. They're you don't have to ask them to feedback on behalf of the breakout group. And they're the ones who will often at the end say, well, how do you do what you do? How do I get into this? I'd love to do this. If you haven't already said to them, you'd make a great facilitator. So there's something in it. It's a personality. It's a motive. The synapses become electrified in that group setting. And I don't know you. I don't know if you're like this, but for me, I'm very different one-on-one or in small groups. If I'm on an airplane, I don't really want to be chatty with somebody. I'm not really an extrovert. But when I'm in a group setting, there's something new emerges. That's why I was smiling at your origin story.
I can share our origin story as well, John. I mean, I can remember being like you, Leanne, so being in a group setting, being in that type of experience, and just almost stepping back from the experience itself and looking at it and thinking, oh gosh, this is so amazing. Like, look at what's happening to the group. Look at what is emerging. And how can I create that? How can I do more of that for other people, right? And I remember an early on session, it was actually, John, you weren't there actually in that session, but I remember being a participant in a session, and we were working on what seemed like the impossible game, and that like it was just impossible to get this thing done based on the challenge. And I won't tell you the details of the challenge, because from the time I tell you the details of the challenge, you can never do it again. You can only do it once. It's one of those things that you cannot unsee. So once you know the answer. And we were just struggling with this for hours and hours and hours, and just struggling. And the facilitator left us in this really tense moment of trying to discover an answer and just going round and round and really getting deep into the frustrating emotions of struggling with something. And then at a later point, making a few very thoughtful interventions and seeing the group completely change and be able to solve the problem. So that move from being stuck in what seemed like something impossible to just a few, thoughtful and targeted questions or, concepts or whatever it is that they offered to the group to just completely enlighten everyone. And that shift was just, I'll never forget the experience. The shift was just so powerful. And it's part of why I think I talk about the experience as much for me, Leanne, because when I think about workshops, I think about what is the experience that people are going to go through? What do I want them to go through? And even that, I reflect back even on that emotional cycle that I went through in that experience. What type of emotions do I want to take people through in a session? And how am I going to let them sit there a little bit? Because if they move too fast, then they almost don't feel the emotion, right? So what type of emotion do you want them to go through, and how are you going to help navigate them through that as a facilitator? I think that's one of the things that I really think about when I start thinking about facilitation, and what's going through my mind is the experience and the emotions, and how will I get them to engage in that and to really sort of get their hands dirty. I think that experience that I had is well imprinted on me in terms of the emotion and the engagement and all of those things. And it was very enlightening for me.
I had I'm a WhatsApp friend with a guy in the Netherlands, Yuri, and we were just WhatsApping the other day talking about that, like kind of risks that we've taken in workshops. And he was giving an example of, he was brought into, it was an innovation speech, but it was about how boredom can drive creativity. And so for the first 5 minutes, he just puts this video on the screen of like, I think he said, of just like pouring water into a glass. It just repeats. And he's just standing on stage, and this is going on for 3 minutes, right? 4 minutes. And it's like, I mean, you got to really kind of create a conversation around the client and like how risk averse and like having the courage to try things and really create an experience. And I think it can be tough sometimes, because I think traditionally we're taught, come in, you have the PowerPoint, you go through the objectives. But what you're talking about, Trish, and I'm sure in your experiences as well, John, is like actually having the courage to try something a little bit different and embody those emotions in the workshop.
The rule breaker and the rule maker. It's a very strange set of powers to exert. The person you mentioned, I don't know them, but gosh, they're an anarchist. to put on a video like that looping is very brave. I mean, love it. Well, we talked earlier about the mind of the facilitator, and there's to use a silly caricature, the facilitator at the front of the room holding the marker with the flip chart with the slides, etc. And whether that's an accurate, right, it's a caricature, it's not an accurate representation, but there are the things that people see. They see nifty sticky notes, they see different games that people can join in as they work through a process. They see the process itself in terms of an agenda, but what's going on the inside? What goes on in the mind of the facilitator? It looks very calm, placid, and controlled. But if you crack open that door, what's going on in your mind as a facilitator? Is it as placid as that, or is it something a bit more complex?
Tricia, I'd love to hear from you, because I think you epitomize that what John was just talking about in terms of calmness. Is that
Wow,
always the case?
thank
for you?
you. Thank you, Leanne. What's going on inside of the mind and facilitator? If I give a calm demeanor on the outside, then I think, wow, because in my head, there's definitely a lot going on in terms of things that I'm thinking out, things that I'm thinking about, things that I'm looking at, what I'm being observant for, what I'm listening for, just what I'm sensing, the intuition, the energy in the room. All of those are things that I'm tuning into. And as you tune into all of those senses, you're just I'm thinking a lot about how do I keep the group moving forward? And that doesn't necessarily mean the stated agenda and outcomes. I mean, I think you always have that when you're designing and you're prepping, but when I get in the room, for me, in some ways, it's less about that. It's where is the group now and what is the big move that they can make together? And that might be different to the outcomes. And that's okay, because I think if the group makes a move together, as they move together in terms of their thinking or the problem or whatever it is, we don't get to the stated outcome, it's a big step forward for them because they can't do that on their own without the help. So I'm constantly thinking about where can I take them? How can I ignite their thinking and move them forward? And I'm tuned in, like I said, to all of those different things. I'm constantly thinking about, do I need to make a change? Do I need to change the way that they're working together? Do I need to change how they're engaging? Do I need to step back or do I need to step in? Do I need to just observe and let them sit there a little bit longer? Or do I need to make an intervention to help them reframe or see something differently? So there are all these tensions that are definitely going through my mind. I think if you crack it open, there'd be lots of balls juggling or gears turning in there. What about you, Leanne?
Yeah, exactly. And I think, I mean, at the end of the day, I'm exhausted, like physically, and mentally, because I've just been so switched in. What I liked about what you said, Tricia, is a lot of the focus that you're talking about was actually on the group, right? When I talk about being a first-time facilitator, my issue was the internal dialogue was on me. How am I presenting? How am I running this instruction? And so the switch has been that focus on the group. And I also like that phrase, like tuning into that. So it's being very mindful, but at the same time, you're also playing a technical role. I think that John was alluding to earlier. It's like the timekeeper as well, like the person, like the logistics, like getting the room temperature right, like making sure there's all this stuff that we carry so many different roles. Yeah. So I've had feedback in a session before where there was a challenging situation and everyone said, a few people came up to me at the end and said, oh, you handled that really well. You were very calm. And I was like, in my own mind at that moment, it was insanely messy, trying to think through, 5 different options to take and which one is it? Like you said, do we actually stop and do we go there in the situation? Do we call a break? So I think it is interesting, the dichotomy between what's going on in our minds and yet that sort of calm and relaxed presence we need to project for the group in that moment. John, how does it look? How does your mind look on the inside?
Well, no, it's just, you crack it open and it's not necessarily the circus music may not start immediately. But what both of you said resonates with me because you are simultaneous, you are observing, you're orientating, you're carrying with you, not dozens of frameworks, but you're carrying models and heuristics and rules of thumb to kind of pull up, say, to gauge where people are at and to decide on the next intervention. And as you said, there are all the small things like, is the room temperature correct? Where are we in the schedule? Do people need a break, etc.? All your basic amenities. But then there, do I have strong characters? Who's speaking? What are they saying? Who's not speaking? And all that. And the thing that resonated the most, I think both of you have alluded to it, that sense of exhaustion. And it's not just, what's that book, Leaders Eat Last. And I'm like, well, buddy, facilitators rarely get to eat at all. But it's not just that. Even if we are nourished, it is exhausting. And people say, well, how is it exhausting writing on a whiteboard or moving flip charts? I said, that's not the tiresome bit. It's thinking of everybody equally in all the multiple scenarios in my universe that I call my workshop. That's exhausting.
Don, you allude to something there because you're thinking about everybody individually and you're adding 2 other things to think about, thinking about the group all together. And then you're thinking about yourself as well, just in terms of like your self-care, in terms of what you need as well. Like, you need something, like you're saying, facilitators barely eat when they have a session. you might even not even find time to go to the bathroom, you know what I mean? Because you're constantly just between, or everyone else is on a break, but they're talking to you because they want to say something or they want to check in with you. And you don't even have just a couple of minutes to just run to the bathroom really quickly if you're on your own. So sometimes it's as crazy as that, right? But yet we appear calm and collected.
No, and I'd just like to say to all the listeners, it's fine reaching out to us on breaks. I mean, that's what we're there for as facilitators. Don't think that you're bugging us. But of course, cast a kind eye to our basic biological needs every now and again. But it's in those spaces often that those interventions, the signal, the data, the observation, the request perhaps is going to come to you. It's you're always on.
Definitely always on.
Leanne, what's your go-to model? What's the one that you kind of carry, if we open up that door in your head, that's in operation when you are facilitating?
I honestly, the go-to for me is I think the GROW model is probably one of my favorites in terms of in a workshop. And then I'll talk about a model I use for design a bit later on. But like you said, John, I think the power of frameworks is it just gift wraps information and makes it really accessible for us to access. So when we are in moments where we need to pull on something quickly, the fact that we've got this beautiful conceptual model in our minds that we can go to is so valuable. So GROW, goal, options, reality, way forward. I use it even in conversations with my husband when we're looking at, where do we go for lunch? It's just part of my life, really. And I think I love the flexibility of it in terms of if there is a moment in a situation where there is tension or we want to make a big move that Tricia talks about, it's restating the goal and saying, where are we now? What are the options? And what's one way to move forward? So that's my go-to in a workshop. In terms of designing workshops, in my book, I wrote about the SPARK framework. And that's because, I don't know if you're like me, but I'm a bit of a fire hose with ideas. And so when I would go to design a workshop, it's such a creative endeavor. I would get so lost in cool things that we could do. And it was a bit of a mess. And last year I was having to design workshops really quickly. So I just developed the SPARK framework as a way to go through a linear process to create a workshop at the end of it. So S is for setup, really thinking about asking that question, what's the experience you want to create? P is for power up. That's powering up what we spoke about, actually. So powering up yourself as a facilitator and getting in state, and then switching that focus to the group. So getting them engaged almost immediately, the moment your workshop starts. A is for activity. So I don't talk about content. I talk about activities in terms of what are the things that we can do together to help create that experience and get that result. Okay, and R is for review, because I think often during our workshops, we get so excited doing the things that we actually rarely ever stop. And it's usually in the last 5 or 10 minutes where we pause to reflect and review. And often that isn't long enough to really build on what you picked up and what the group got from that. And then K is for keep. And the reason I put this into my framework is because as facilitators, if we're often creating and designing new things, we just move on without actually looking at what worked during that session, what were the great models and activities and instructions that worked, how do I keep that and build on for the next workshop? Yeah. So, that's why I love a framework. It just helps you get from A to B. And I'm curious, both of you have a podcast about models and frameworks. I know you've worked on a new one about engagement. Do you want to share a bit about that or what your favorite tool is?
Yeah. For a start, I want to say that I love your SPARK model. It's so great. I love the fact that you're talking about especially those latter elements of review and keep. It's really hard for us as facilitators. We spend so much time thinking about the workshop, hosting the actual experience, conducting the workshop, and then we move on to the next thing. And that time to really review and to think about what worked really well and why did that work so well and what am I going to keep, and where did I even struggle in terms of the activities, and just that whole reflection process is something that is so important for our learning and for our deepening our expertise in our craft. And we often skip past that just for ourselves because we move on to something else. So I love that is part of your framework that you're talking about in terms of SPARK. I could talk about models for as long as you want to talk about models, right, John? And I talk about models, like you said, every episode of every little model. And we love models for all the reasons that you said. And I love how you said that it just gift wrap information. I think that's so true, right? It's this little package of information that is so helpful in many different situations, right? They help us, reframe challenges, think about things in a different light, shift paradigms, all the things that models can do. And someone said to me recently, which I thought was so incredibly useful as well, that what's so great about models is that they give us confidence. They give us confidence to try something because it gives us, like you said, this little package. And so I can work with this little package. I don't have all of these choices, but I have this little choices just in this little package. And that gives me confidence to try something. And I think that model, your model and your book is so great for that, because it's about giving us as facilitators that confidence to go forth and design a workshop and not get lost in it or overly, spend more time than's needed in the messy creativeness that we can all enjoy, and all aspects of helping us to actually navigate through the workshop experience, which I think is wonderful. John, what are your thoughts?
Well, no, it's I love listening to to you both describe the kinds of things that you kind of, the lens you look through to kind of simplify and make sense of a very complex or even a very creative situation where there are so many possibilities, so many scenarios, so many possibilities, so many opportunities, so many new things that you want to try, just because as facilitators we often do. There's a set playlist, if you will. There are some of the hits that you play, but you want to try something new, explore that. But a good framework like that just helps remove a little bit of that complexity and focus. I will always, much like you two probably, will always have a good 2x2 matrix to hand that can be whipped out, high and low of something versus high and low of something else, just to get us through this difficult conversation of this difficult decision. But the one that the Spark model I love about it, again, I love the review, I love the activity piece, that focus on what we're going to do rather than content we need to cover, because that turns it into, it runs the risk of moving out of facilitation into training, into lecture, into education. The activity is a collective experience. That's why I love that was selected for the acronym. Tricia, the one that we've talked about, and you've been behind creating it and using it, is what I like to call my great big sound equalizer on the mixing desk of the nine engagement dimension.
Yeah, I'll tell you a little bit about the 9 dimensions. I think it plays so well into Leanne's model and the whole activity section of that. And so how do you make choices about what types of activities that you're going to do, right? How do you make choices? And like I said, I think a lot about the experience that I'm going to take people through, or that I want them to have in the workshop or the session that I'm facilitating. And for me, a lot of that comes down to engagement. If I can keep people engaged in the session, then I know that they're doing their best thinking, right? Because they're leaning in. Engagement to me says they're leaning in, they're in this conversation, they're present, they're focused, they're thinking on it. Engagement to me does not mean energy. It's not high energy. So it's not people running around the room. It is engagement. It's they are engaged in what is happening in the conversation, in the challenge, in the problem. They haven't checked out. They're not looking to leave. They want to be there. They're interested in being there. So how do you know, like, as a facilitator, if people are engaged? And this was the question for me that led itself to creating this model, the 9 dimensions of engagement, because I think as facilitators, there are a lot of things that we do naturally to keep people engaged, but we're not even necessarily tuned into why they work or how they work or for what is the reason in which they work. We just know that they do work. And so I started to unpack, well, what does that really look like? And it came up with these 9 different dimensions of engagement. And what they are is basically 9 different areas that you could flex and manipulate and vary throughout the session to keep engagement high. It doesn't mean that you stay, you keep, like John says, it's like that mixing board. So you keep moving them up and down, and you can think about any one activity that you do, and you could look at these 9 dimensions, and you can say, in this activity, this is actually playing on dimension 1 or dimension 3 and dimension 5. And then you could look at another activity and say that, oh, well, that's actually playing with dimension 7 and dimension 2, for example, right? So there are different dimensions, and you can start to see, and I use it when I'm designing sessions to say, do I have enough variation? Or am I stuck in doing one type of thing over and over? And then I also use it when I'm reflecting, Leanne, in your kind of what do I keep bit. So when I think about, well, what worked well, I also think back to the 9 dimensions of engagement and think, well, this worked well because it was invoking this dimension or the other dimension. And I know I've been saying the word dimension a lot, so I will tell you what they are because there are 9 of them. But they're things like, I'll give you a few because I won't go on about it, but things like varying group size. How do I work in group size? That's the most obvious one that we think about as facilitators. Do I have people working individually, or do I have them working as a full group or some version of small groups in between? That is a dimension that you can play with as a facilitator. Another dimension that you can play with is the modality in which they are interacting. So they're using visual. Are we using visuals as a way of interacting and having a conversation? Or are we using props and kinesthetic things? Or are we using audio? Or are we using reading and writing? So that kind of the VARC modalities. Or are we using social interaction as a way of exploring something? So the modality in which people interact is another dimension, for example. And a third one, just to give you 3, is what type of energy level am I invoking? Is it a quiet, calm energy where I have people reflecting and maybe there's calm music playing and they're just thinking on their own and there's some white space and it's just a moment for internalizing and tapping into your own thoughts? Or is it really high energy, what we call kind of red energy? Is it high energy where, you know, people are moving around the room, it's really fast paced, it's almost like speed dating and improv, and it's just, you know, really high energy? Or is it a version of somewhere in between? So for each of the dimensions, there are different scales, they're bookends to the scale, and there are different options that you can choose in between to know, well, where can I vary and make changes? So like I said, I use it in thinking about how am I going to, when I'm designing this experience, where am I playing on the different dimensions, which dimension and where am I at? Am I anchored in one place too much and too long, or am I changing things up? And then I use it in reflecting in terms of what worked well. So it helps me just think about the experience I'm trying to create and how I get people engaged in it.
I absolutely love it. I think something I talk about in the book is contrast, and I think that really relates to engagement often. Because the workshops where I've been a participant in, where I feel like my engagement is maybe waning, is because it's been the same old, it's like turn to the person next to you, like, and that there hasn't been any variation in that. I also love that you got time and place in there. Sometimes the simplest thing you can do is like after lunch to say, let's just all go for a walk. Let's just step outside of this room. It's amazing. I think you're 100% right through the activities. It's like, how do you weave your model in and just test that? Are we playing? Are we mixing? Are we DJing here, or is it just pretty static?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so I think there's so many models that we can choose from. And the one that, you know, as they say, all models are wrong and some are useful, right? So we've been talking about 2 here, the Spark model, your Spark model, you mentioned Grow model in there as well. I talked about engagement dimensions. John, you talk about a good old 2x2 matrix, and I've seen you many a times whip those out, and I don't know how you come up with them as quickly as you do, but you are on the mark even in creating them on the spot.
Old reliable. Most of the work has already been done by the shapes.
There is, last year I did every Tuesday I brought out a new 2x2 matrix. And
oh yes, that's fine.
Yeah, because all you do is pick, like you said, John, you just pick 2 dimensions and you play off the extremes. And it's incredible what emerges from that, and how groups love the second they see a 2x2, they're like, oh, where am I now? And where do I want to be? What am I liking under quadrant? There's so many great questions just on a 2x2.
No, exactly. Now, I'm sure I'm more than just a pretty 2x2 matrix, but it's a very reliable go-to. It gets me out of a lot of jams. Thank you for sharing both of those frameworks. Again, I just love being able to speak with other professionals, and I do look up and admire the work that the 2 of you have done in your respective fields. That the learning about what a practitioner goes through and thinks of, I think is very hidden to a lot of clients. It's something that is, you know, ranging from, oh, can't you just throw something together and run us through a 1-hour workshop, and which doesn't do justice to all the prep work that the Spark framework speaks to doesn't do justice to what's going to be an hour to achieve what again. Is that really going to move the needle for whatever we're trying to do? So I think it's so helpful and useful for me to be reminded of that, and for our listeners to remember there's a lot that goes into a good experience. If you want a good experience, if you want to solve or address some big, meaningful, valuable issues, challenges, opportunities, then facilitation is going to be a lot richer if you allow it to do what it needs to do. It's going to be a lot richer in experience for you. We had a guest and a good friend of ours, Robin Parsons, from Parsons Dialogue. She wrote a blog article a while ago about what facilitation isn't. And she says, if memory serves, it's not counseling. I'm not there to give you my professional feedback as to how well the group is working together or what you need to do to change. I'm not a consultant to give you the answer. I'm not here to, I'm not training you, although you were building capability, but I'm not training you. This is something different. Our skills are in designing experiences that move a group, however defined and of whatever number, from A as defined and to B as defined, with the hopes that they will get to C and D, etc. That's fundamentally different from all these other things that many clients will come to us and say, I just need you to fix the strong personality in the room. Well, it may get fixed or addressed, but that's not the role that I'm playing. Anyway, that's a bit of a stream of consciousness where you have left my mind wandering.
And what you're making me think of, John, what you're making me think of is, as with most things, facilitation is a beautiful blend of both art and science. It is,
Yes.
The art of tuning in and reading and tapping into your own intuition in terms of what the group needs. It's the art of all of those things. And then it's the science of the design and the process that we take people through, and and all these other elements. But it's this beautiful blend of the art and the science that comes together in that experience that people have, is what you're making me think of.
I mean, it's one of the questions that I've got for each of you, each of us, is what was the most pivotal facilitation experience that you've had that kind of changed who you are as a facilitator? We talked about the origin stories, maybe put that to one side. That's what brought us in. But a pivotal moment that changed who you are as a facilitator. If you have one that you're willing to share, of course I will have one, but I'll let anyone who feels moved to speak on that one go first.
Yeah, mine it was when I was in Canada delivering a leadership workshop. And there's a situation, we're doing an activity, and it was on the first day, just after lunch. I thought I'd created enough psychological safety in the room to participate, but I discovered that as we were doing the activity, one person decided, and they were very adamant that they wouldn't participate. And it was the first time, I'd only been doing this for a few years, but it was the first time that someone actively resisted. And that made me realize that maybe I wasn't reading the signals correctly, maybe the design or the timing, like what Tricia was talking about. There are several modalities that weren't switched on in the right direction that would have enabled that behavior. So, but also forced me to think about, how do you address that? What do you do? Because that impacts the whole dynamics of the group. And shortly after that, the next person then resisted. And so we're going on this very slippery slope. And so that was really the watershed moment for me, is that this isn't about, like you said, just pulling together a 1-hour workshop. There has to be intention behind it in terms of how you design and build that trust over time. So that really made me wake up. Yeah.
What did you do, Leanne? Tell us what you did.
In the moment, what I did in that moment was, at the beginning of the day, we had done not rules of engagement, but how do you want to play the day, reinforcing the values of the company. And I had that on a flip chart. And so thankfully I went back to it. We also had the ladder of learning, and another framework where we talk about getting outside of your comfort zone. So I went back to those two things and reiterated the agreements from the morning. And I went on to the next person, and then he agreed to step up and do it. We got it back on track, but I still, that night I was ruminating on it. I really didn't, even the next morning, I was like, I don't want to show up to this group again. It worked really well, but I feel like I also had just even during the break, had a chat to this person, because there's more. It's not just our workshop, people coming in with their lives and the stuff that's going on in their personal lives too, that impact their experience. So yeah, I think we have to, that was a big moment. What about you, Tricia?
This maybe relates a little bit to some of the courage stuff that we were talking about, and your friend who had the water looping on video. I read the book, and if anyone hasn't read it, it's such an amazing book called The Circle Way by Christina Baldwin. And, you know, there was always something for me about how people physically gather. So, you know, and as facilitators, we think a lot about how we lay things out in the room. Are we, you know, how are we going to lay things out? Where are we going to put the chairs? What type of seating, right? And if you're hosting a workshop in a hotel or something, they're always going to ask you, you know, how do you want it set up, right? And there are some typical ways, mostly with round tables and stuff like that. And that was the kind of typical way that I used to set things up, round table for people to be able to work on. And, you know, you have some, whether I use a lot of, you know, big boards to draw on and that kind of stuff. So around the room and things like that. And I read the Circle Way book, and because there was always something missing for me around really getting into the conversation and creating a space that would encourage people to connect on a different level and really engage in deep, thoughtful dialogue. And after I read this book, I was just serendipitously about to host a leadership workshop as well. And I was like, I'm just going to do this. I'm going to try this. And I actually had the room set up with a full circle of chairs, with literally a space in the middle where they all brought an artifact to talk about. And they added, part of the check-in for the morning was to speak about why that artifact was powerful to them as a person, what it represented for them. And they all physically placed it in the center of the circle. And the circle became a space for very rich, authentic, vulnerable dialogue. And there is something about that connection of actually sitting in a circle all together. It takes us back to gathering around the fire, to, you know, as a community gathering around the fire to tell stories. And there's something about in the circle, if you read the book as well, they talk about in the circle, you can always see everyone because they're always in your peripheral vision. So even the person next to you is in your peripheral vision. So you're always in essence connected visually to everyone in the room. And it's like a wheel. When you create the energy starts and it picks up momentum in the circle, as opposed to a physical construct of like a square or a box or a boardroom table, which actually makes people very, very opposed to new thinking, for example, that they're very structured and they're in this space. And so there's something with playing with these actual physical constructs of how you get people to sit in a room. And this is, of course, I'm talking about an in-person session, because I know we do a lot of things virtually now and we lose a little bit of that. Although there are some platforms that have been trying to recreate that. So the circle experience as well. But that was a very powerful experience to me because something very different happened to that group and they all remember it deeply. You know, it was a very powerful moment for them. They remember what each of them brought to the circle to talk about. They remember what it looked like to have those artifacts in the middle and the quality of the conversation that they had. And most of them said at the end, we've never as a team had that depth of a conversation, that true authentic level of a conversation where we've shared as openly as we did. And obviously that wasn't the only thing that we did, but it was a very pivotal moment for me in terms of trying something that I'd never tried before and experimenting with something. And luckily in this case, a positive impact on the group. I suppose it could have gone another way as well, because not everything you try always goes well. But that for me was an experience. And I still do it. I do it all the time now. So when I set up rooms, I will always create a space where there's a full circle. For my preferred design in terms of a setup of a room is a full circle of chairs for everyone, and then small working tables on the other end of the room so I can split them up. And then I have cocktail tables in the middle as well. So I have 3 very different spaces in the room, one for deep conversation and that kind of authentic conversation and checking in and checking out where I want everybody to share. Another for experimenting and, you know, getting into just digging in and trying some new things in the working space. And there's social space where there's lots of, you know, prompts and things to play with and that kind of stuff as well. So I try and set up different spaces in the room. And I found that to be very interesting and impactful on the group. What about you, John? You have one you want to share?
I asked the question, now I have to share it. And so most of my capabilities are forged in the fire of failure and embarrassment. And so have to crack open that memory box. But no, very briefly, I was facilitating a working session with an executive team at a utility company in Canada, in Toronto. And we had a couple of days to work through some gates, and I believe that I had found myself more rigidly focused on the process and the gates as opposed to the dynamics going on, because I had been, I'd bring the group together, we'd split them out into working groups, bring them back together, split them out again, maybe mix some of the groups. And somewhere in the second day, I got the feedback, which would have been helpful on the first day, but it came on the second day. We don't get to choose when the feedback arrives necessarily, unless we make time to review periodically. As I said, this is the forging of my capability. But I got the feedback from one of the executives. They said, John, you have to stop breaking us apart. We never get a chance to work together. We, as an executive team, and I had simply assumed, but in my defense at that stage, I had just assumed that they worked together, and I had never investigated to understand how often they interact. And they said, no, John, please, we'd like to work this through together. It might mean that we have to go a little more slowly, but that's okay. And that's, that released me from that perceived obligation that, I had stepped into this arrangement thinking I've got to get them through this thing in 2 days. And they said, what's really, and I don't think even they understood it truly, but, they said, it's actually the value of us working together and developing some proper working relationships that makes up for the fact that we didn't quite get that action log together on addressing our Q1 priorities, whatever that was. Anyway, that's changed the way I worked as a facilitator. In a way, it required me to have a little bit more confidence to listen to my gut, but also to tell my gut what I might be looking for, such as who's in the room? Who are these people? What is this a team? How have they worked together? And to start asking those questions before we even convene to design a better experience. So I hope you treat my vulnerable story with great care, but it did make me a different facilitator.
I love that. It's interesting because I'm with you, John. I've had a similar situation where it's like, I feel like I'm there to drive the outcome, but the response was, well, actually, this is the first time we actually have the space to have a conversation. So that's really valuable as well, like that experience of conversation. And I think it's a good highlight, a good call out in terms of balancing that.
I've thoroughly enjoyed the wide-ranging conversation. Routinely amazed that we can develop some intimate conversation about being practitioners across many time zones over this medium we call Zoom. So I really appreciate everything that you have shared and I've learned from you. What are your reflections on the conversation?
We'll be editing a lot of podcasts because I had technical difficulties. And what I want to share with everyone that's listening is that the patience and the professionalism of both John and Tricia in handling that was remarkable. And when I got back onto the call, I felt very welcomed and everything was fine. Plus, being in a conversation, this was an experiment for all three of us. But the fact that we're all facilitators, it kept moving along. There were new questions and things to explore. We were riffing off each other and connecting through and back the conversation. So I think facilitators also make wonderful conversationalists. And so that's my big reflection. And thank you both for being so patient with my tech challenges as well.
Of course, Leanne. No apology required whatsoever. I think my reflection from today, something that we probably all know, deep inside, and maybe we don't say out loud a lot, but just we've talked about so much in terms of what goes on in the mind of a facilitator, inside the mind of a facilitator. And I'm sure if we continue this conversation for another hour, we would talk about a whole host of other things that go on inside of the mind of a facilitator. I think one of the things that really stands out for me through all the stories that we told and the experiences that we had is that with all the things that we know and that we're thinking about, whether they're tactical or whether they're experiential or whatever there is as well, there's something about tapping into your own intuition about what's happening as well, and just finding a way to be present so that you can hear that for yourself. I think it's a big part of facilitation, so that you're not worried about all the noise and all the many things, but you can feel your own intuition sort of guiding you in terms of what needs to happen next. And I think that's standing out for me through the stories that we've all told, that kind of tapping in or tuning into your own intuition and being able to listen and hear that for yourself. So I think that's what I'm taking away from our conversation today. So thank you very much to both of you for raising that up for me in terms of the importance of really creating space to listen to your own intuition.
No, my own reflection is just to build on the musical metaphors. Is this has been like a jam session, allowing somebody to kind of take the melody of the music in a direction and find a way to complement that, and then to take that direction yourself, and then suggest that we move in a different place, and just to try that mutuality is something I appreciate. So that's my reflection. I have to say thank you so much to both of you. I'll include myself. Thank you to all three of us for creating the space for this experimental jam session. I've really appreciated it.
Absolutely.
Me.
Thank you.